Today I want to talk about Shular versus United States, decided by the Supreme Court in February of 2020. I will warn you that this gets very much into the weeds of federal sentencing law, so if this is not an area of the law that's relevant to you, it might be best to move on to a different video. But for those of us that do practice federal sentencing law, it's an incredibly important opinion that really gets to the heart of some of the sentencing issues we see, particularly with the application of the categorical approach and how it applies to different types of clauses within recidivism statutes. Now, this is probably the 7th or 8th case the Supreme Court has heard on the Armed Career Criminal Act in the past 10 or 15 years. But what's unique about it, it's the first one, to my memory, that deals with the definition of serious drug offense and doesn't focus on the violent felony definition. Now, as we know, when we're trying to figure out how to apply the categorical approach, it kind of looks different depending on what type of language you're applying it to. Now, the categorical approach is a very big topic. There's a lot of cases to talk about. It was invented by the Supreme Court in 1990. There's probably 4 important cases that you should know. Taylor in 1990, followed by Shepard and Descamps and Mathis. The only reason I mention that is I'm probably going to do a series of other videos about the history and development and application of the categorical approach. So you may reference those at a later date, but for now I'm going to have to assume some degree of knowledge. So here's what we knew prior to Shular about the categorical approach. We know that when we're looking, for example, at the Armed Career Criminal Act, if we're applying it to an enumerated offense, say burglary or extortion or arson, we look at the generic form of the enumerated offense, and then we compare the breadth of that generic form to the elements of the statute of prior conviction. We learned that as early as Taylor in 1990. But later, courts had to struggle with how to apply the categorical approach to other types of clauses. For example, in the Armed Career Criminal Act's definition of violent felony, you also see an elements clause, sometimes called a force clause, when you're wondering about whether the statute of prior conviction has as an element the use, attempted use, or threatened use of force. Courts have applied that differently than the enumerated offense. Still a categorical approach, though, not looking at the conduct of the prior conviction, but rather the elements of the statute of the offense. But now we're trying to answer the question, does that offense necessarily have the use of force as an element? Then with the residual clause, a different form of the categorical approach. This time we're imagining the ordinary case of the offense in seeing whether it has, say, constitutional problems, as we saw in Johnson, in DiMaia, in Davis, or seeing if it survives, like we saw in James versus United States. So we kind of have answers to some of those questions, but what arose in Shular is a different question. Now we're not looking at those 3 different clauses within the definition of violent felony. We're now looking at the definition of serious drug offense. If you were to look at 18 U.S.C. 924E, it defines serious drug offense as a state offense, or in part, as an offense under state law involving manufacturing, distributing, or possessing with intent to distribute a controlled substance. And then we learned that the maximum punishment has to be 10 or more years. So the question the court had to decide here is, how do we construe that language? Do we use a categorical approach? Do we use a conduct-based approach? Or if we do use a categorical approach, what form of the categorical approach do we use? When I was first hearing about Shular versus United States before it was decided, my understanding was that it was going to really be about, do we use a categorical or a conduct-based approach when construing the serious drug offense definition within the Armed Career Criminal Act? As it turns out, when I read the opinion, it wasn't quite about that at all. Both sides, both parties agreed that a form of the categorical approach should apply, but it was simply a question of which form of the categorical approach. In other words, when we worry about manufacturing, distributing, or possessing with intent to distribute, do we treat it more like an enumerated offense where we're trying to evaluate the generic version of a manufacturing offense? Or instead, do we treat it like an elements clause offense where we're simply asking the question of does the statute of prior conviction have that element or that conduct within it? So ultimately what the court did is rejected Mr. Shular's argument that the definition of serious drug offense should be construed through a generic offense approach. What Mr. Shular was arguing is that each one of those listed things in the definition, manufacturing, distributing, possession with intent to distribute, really describes a generic offense. So courts have to come up with the generic version of the offense and then compare that generic version of the offense to the elements of the statute of prior conviction and ask the question that was asked in Taylor, which is simply, does that statute of prior conviction criminalize a broader swath of conduct than the generic version of the offense? Mr. Shular was making this argument because he believed that the generic version of his offense, whether it was manufacturing, distributing, or possession, required a mens rea, a knowledge on his part that the substance itself was illicit. He argued then, by comparison, that his statute of prior conviction for the state offense, if you look at it, doesn't require knowledge that the substance is illicit. Therefore, he believed that his prior conviction should not count toward the 3 you need to be enhanced under the Armed Career Criminal Act. The government argued instead that it should be treated more like an elements clause. It says involving. So we simply ask the question, do the elements of that statute of prior conviction involve manufacturing, distributing, or possession with intent to distribute? Ultimately, the Supreme Court went with the government's interpretation. In doing so, they relied on a case from 2012 called Kawashima versus Holder. There, the Supreme Court had looked at one of the definitions within the INA's aggravated felony definition, specifically to the subsection dealing with cases involving fraud or deceit when the money amount is more than $10,000. There, the court took kind of the elements clause version of the categorical approach rather than treating fraud or deceit as a generic offense. So based on this Kawashima version of the categorical approach, the Supreme Court said that in order to qualify under the Armed Career Criminal Act, a prior state drug offense will qualify as long as it necessarily involves conduct of manufacturing, distributing, or possessing with intent to distribute a controlled substance. Now, in saying so, I just used the word conduct. That's important only for the federal version of the crime that we're looking at, but we're still under a categorical approach. So when we look back at that statute of prior conviction, we're still not looking at the conduct that led to that conviction. We're just looking at the elements, and we're asking whether those elements require conduct involving manufacturing, distributing, or possession with intent to distribute, not whether they actually involved conduct at the time of the offense. Shular versus United States.